I rebuilt my father's company from ashes. But the truth that saved me started in her basement. Inside, one dusty metal box marked confidential. Inside, I found the real will she'd hidden for 10 years. The proof that turned a forgotten son into a man who took everything back. Watch till the end to see how a buried secret destroyed her empire. It all began the day my stepmother read my father's will and said I was left with nothing. My stepmother told everyone my father left me nothing. Those words still echo in my head every time I think about the day we buried him. It was spring in Portland. The kind that smelled like wet soil and regret. My father's funeral felt more like a corporate event than a goodbye. Vera, my stepmother, stood in front of the crowd in her black designer dress, crying softly into a silk handkerchief. Her voice trembled as she spoke about Richard Callaway, the great visionary, founder of Callaway Energy Solutions, devoted husband and father. Every word made me feel smaller, like I didn't belong there. People nodded. Some even clapped politely. I wanted to scream that she didn't even know the man she was pretending to mourn. When it was my turn to speak, I couldn't. I stood beside the casket, watching the way the light hit the polished wood. My father's name was carved deep into it. Permanent and final. I said a quiet thank you under my breath and walked away before anyone noticed the tears. After the burial, Vera invited everyone to the house for refreshments. That house used to feel alive when Dad was around. Now it smelled like flowers and fake sympathy. His office door was closed, locked from the inside. Something Vera said she was doing out of respect. I sat alone on the porch, watching her laugh with the lawyer she'd hired to handle the estate. His name was Collins. Someone I'd never seen before. The original lawyer, Harrison Reed, had been my father's friend for 30 years. I asked where Harrison was, and Vera said he was too old to handle the case. It didn't sound right, but I kept quiet. Later that afternoon, everyone gathered in the study for the reading of the will. Collins adjusted his tie and began reading from a stack of papers. To my beloved wife, Vera Callaway, I leave the family home, all bank accounts, and controlling shares of Callaway Energy Solutions. I waited for my name. To my son, Ethan Callaway, I leave $100,000 to help him start a new chapter in life. That was it. I felt my chest tighten. $100,000 was generous to some people. But not when your father built a company worth nearly $100 million. Not when you had worked beside him for a decade, helping design half of what made the company valuable. I looked at Vera. She didn't look at me. She only dabbed her eyes like this was painful for her. Collins closed the folder. That concludes the reading. I stood up. This can't be right. My father would never. Collins cut me off. Mr. Callaway, this is the final, legally notarized document on file. Where's Harrison? My father trusted him. He drafted the will. Vera finally looked at me, her voice soft but sharp underneath. Ethan, your father made these changes before his accident. He wanted to be sure I was taken care of. You should be grateful he left you anything at all. Her tone burned worse than the words. Everyone avoided my eyes. It was easier for them to believe I was just the bitter son. After the meeting, I followed her into the hallway. Vera, I know you changed something. I know my father didn't want this. She smiled politely. The kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. You should get some rest, dear. Grief makes people imagine things. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet. From my old room upstairs, I saw light flickering under the door of my father's office. I went down the hall, each step slow, deliberate. Through the cracked door, I saw Vera standing by the fireplace, feeding papers into the flames. What are you doing? I asked. She didn't even turn around. Just cleaning up old files. Your father hated clutter. The fire crackled. For a second, I saw something on one of the folders before it burned completely. The label read Confidential, Callaway Estate. I stepped closer. What was that? She turned then, her face calm but her eyes sharp. Some things are better left in the past. Ethan, you should move on. Your father wanted that. I opened my mouth to argue, but the look she gave me froze me in place. Cold, controlled, almost amused. She tossed the last paper into the fire, closed the screen, and brushed off her hands. The smell of burning ink filled the room. When she left, I stayed there staring into the flames until only ashes remained. Something in me changed that night. I didn't know what she'd destroyed, but I knew it mattered. The next morning, she handed me a set of envelopes. These are your share and transfer documents. The money will be wired by next week. I'd appreciate it if you vacated the property soon. Too many memories here. Don't you think? I nodded, though every word tasted like rust. As I packed my bags, I found one of Dad's cufflinks under the desk. He always said he wore them when he needed courage. I slipped it into my pocket. Outside, the spring rain had started again, tapping against the windows like it was trying to say something I couldn't yet hear. I looked back at the house one last time. Vera stood by the window upstairs, watching me leave. I could almost hear her voice in my head. Calm and poisonous. You should be grateful he left you anything. I walked to my car, gripping the cufflink so tight it dug into my palm. That was the day I learned grief isn't what breaks you. Betrayal is. And I had no idea it was only beginning. 10 years passed before I set foot in Portland again. I didn't plan it that way. But time has a way of slipping through your fingers when every day feels the same. After the funeral, I left for Seattle and took the first job I could find. It wasn't glamorous. Just a maintenance engineer at a small energy plant on the outskirts of town. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd rebuild, start my own firm, prove everyone wrong. But proving people wrong costs money. And grief eats time. I blinked. And a decade had gone by. Life became smaller. My marriage didn't survive the weight of it. Nora tried to understand at first. But she grew tired of watching me stare at job boards every night, waiting for a miracle that never came. When she left, she said it wasn't about money. But we both knew it was. You can love someone deeply and still suffocate together. After the divorce, I got to see our daughter Lily twice a month. She was 8 now. With Nora's eyes and my father's stubborn jaw, every time she smiled. It reminded me of the kind of man I was supposed to become. Portland had moved on without me. I saw Vera's face on a business magazine once, while standing in line at a gas station. The headline read, Vera Calloway, the woman who saved Callaway Energy. Her picture showed confidence, power, and that same polite smile that had burned itself into my memory. The article mentioned her stepson briefly, a line that said, Ethan Callaway chose to pursue independent ventures. I laughed out loud. My independent venture was keeping an old truck running and paying rent on time. Caleb, her son, had become her golden boy. He was 28 now. The future of sustainable technology. According to the company's website, he'd inherited not only my father's position but also his legacy. Every headline about him felt like another nail in a coffin I hadn't realized I was still lying in. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Thursday. Thick beige envelope with a real stamp instead of a printed label. Inside was a formal notice from a real estate agency in Portland. The house I grew up in was being listed for sale. It said Vera Calloway intended to liquidate the property in alignment with estate consolidation. The closing date was in 10 days. I read the letter 3 times, sitting at the tiny kitchen table in my apartment. The words blurred into each other, but one sentence stayed sharp. All personal items remaining on the property will be discarded. Most of my things were gone years ago. But my father's office, his study in the basement, was full of old prototypes and sketches we'd worked on together. I hadn't been allowed to touch them since the funeral. I didn't want Vera selling them as trophies. That night, I called Nora. I need to go back to Portland, I said. She sighed on the other end. It's been 10 years. Ethan. What's left there? My father's work. My name. She was quiet for a while before saying, just don't come back with more ghosts than you left with. The drive to Portland took 4 hours. I didn't play music. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt. By the time I reached the city limits, the sky had turned gray. The kind of sky that warned of rain. Portland always looked like it was holding back tears. I parked across from the old Callaway house. The place looked smaller than I remembered. The hedges were trimmed too neatly. The windows replaced. The brick, a brighter shade of red. Vera's touch was everywhere, erasing every trace of my father's style. The porch light was still the same though. Dad had installed it himself. Said every house needed a light that stayed on no matter what. I stared at it for a long time before walking up the path. Vera opened the door herself. She was older. Her blonde hair streaked with gray. But her posture hadn't changed. She looked me up and down like she was measuring something invisible. "Well," she said softly, "you look stable." "I got your real estate notice," I replied. "I just came to pick up a few things before you sell." Her smile didn't move. Her eyes. "Of course. I didn't think you'd care about this place anymore." Behind her, the living room was spotless. New furniture. Modern art. Everything cold and perfect. No trace of the man who used to read engineering journals at that same coffee table. "Caleb's not here," I asked. "He's in Germany. Meeting with investors." Her tone carried pride. Almost like she wanted me to envy it. "We're finalizing a major sale. A partnership that will secure the company's future." "You mean selling it?" She folded her arms. "It's called growth. Ethan. Something you might understand if you'd stayed involved." I wanted to tell her I was never given the chance. Instead, I just nodded. "I'll be out of your way in a day or two." She handed me a set of keys. "The basement door still sticks. You'll need some muscle." I didn't respond. I walked past her into the hallway. Every picture on the wall was of Vera and Caleb smiling at company events. Ribbon cuttings. Charity galas. My father's face was gone. Mine too. It was like we had been edited out of our own story. I spent the rest of the evening wandering the house, trying to remember the sounds that used to fill it. My father's laugh. The way the floorboards creaked near his office door. The faint hum of his old record player. Everything now was silent. When I reached the basement door, I tried the handle. It was stiff. Just like she said. The smell of dust and old wood hit me as it creaked open. The air felt heavier. Colder. As if it hadn't moved in years. I flicked the light switch. Nothing. So I stood there in the half-dark, staring down the narrow steps that led to the basement I hadn't seen since I was 32. For a moment, I almost turned back. Maybe Nora was right. Maybe I was just chasing ghosts. But something in me, the same quiet voice that had whispered the night of the funeral, told me this wasn't over. I tightened my grip on the railing and stepped down into the dark. The air down there felt heavier than I remembered. Like the basement itself was holding its breath. My boots left prints in the dust. Years of silence pressing against me from every corner. The pull chain for the light barely moved. And when it did, a single bulb flickered weakly to life. Shadows stretched across the walls, crawling over the shelves of old boxes and tools my father once kept. I walked slowly, fingertips grazing the workbench he built when I was a kid. I could almost hear him again, telling me to hand him the wrench. That precision was about patience. The surface was clean. Too clean. Like someone had wiped it down recently. Vera's doing. No doubt. She never liked dust. Or memories. The basement had always been my father's place. A small radio used to sit by the window, playing jazz while he worked late. Now it was gone. And the only sound was the drip of a leaky pipe in the far corner. I started moving boxes. One by one. Looking for something to take with me. Anything that still smelled like him. Most of it was junk old blueprints. Bare bolts. Pieces of machinery I couldn't recognize anymore. Then I noticed one box pushed back into a darker corner behind a metal shelving unit. It was different from the rest. Smaller. Heavier. Covered in a thin layer of concrete dust. I tried to pull it out, but the shelf scraped loudly against the floor. I froze. Listening. Upstairs. A door opened. Then shut. Vera's voice called faintly. "Ethan. Are you still down there?" "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual, just grabbing a few things. Her footsteps creaked above me. "Don't take anything that isn't yours." I forced a laugh. Wouldn't dream of it. Her footsteps faded, but I waited another full minute before moving again. My pulse thudded in my ears. I pushed the shelf aside completely. And that's when I saw it. A section of wall looked newer than the rest. A small patch where the paint didn't quite match. I pressed my hand against it, and it shifted slightly. Hollow. I found a hammer on the bench and tapped around the edges. The sound changed. Softer. A loose wooden panel popped out. revealing a shallow compartment. Inside was a small metal box, about the size of a briefcase, rusted around the hinges but still intact, damped on top, barely visible under the dust, were the words, "Confidential. Callaway Estate." For a second, I just stared. My breath caught in my throat. I ran my fingers over the letters, brushing away years of grime. The box was locked, but the latch had corroded. I used the hammer again and pried it open. Inside were neatly folded documents, their edges yellowed but dry. On top was a letter written in my father's handwriting. "If anything happens, trust the basement." That was all it said. No greeting, no explanation. Just that. Beneath it lay a thick packet of papers bound with a faded ribbon. I opened it carefully. And there it was. My father's will. The real one. The first page bore the seal of the Oregon Notary Office. The signature was his. Clear and bold. Not the shaky version from the document Collins had read at the funeral. I flipped through the pages. Every line was like a heartbeat. The distribution was clear. Vera would be cared for with a trust and the house. But the controlling interest in Callaway Energy Solutions would go entirely to me. His only son. My name was on every page. I sat down hard on the cold concrete floor. 10 years of humiliation. Of watching Vera build an empire off my father's name while the world believed I was the useless son. All of it rushed through me like fire. My hands trembled. Half from rage. Half from disbelief. Above me, the floor creaked again. Vera's heels. Slow and deliberate. I quickly closed the box, heart hammering, and slid it back into the compartment, covering it with the loose panel. I grabbed a few random blueprints from another shelf, just in case she came down. The basement door opened. "You're still at it," she said, her silhouette outlined by the light from the kitchen. "Just about done," I answered, keeping my voice steady. She stepped down a few stairs, arms crossed. "Funny. I thought you hated this place. Guess I just wanted to remember what it felt like to build something." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You always were sentimental. Just make sure you don't take anything that belongs to the company." I smiled faintly. "Don't worry, Vera. I wouldn't steal from family." For a second, I thought she caught the edge in my voice. But she only gave that thin smile of hers and turned to leave. The door closed. The lock clicked. I waited until her footsteps disappeared again. Then I let out the breath I'd been holding. My palms were sweaty, my shirt clinging to my back. The box was still there, untouched. I pulled it out once more and studied the letter again. "If anything happens, trust the basement." The old man must have known she'd try something. He'd hidden his will here for a reason. But how had she managed to replace it so easily? And how deep did this go? I stared up at the ceiling where her footsteps had been, feeling the weight of the house pressing down on me. She thought she'd buried the truth under a layer of paint and lies. But she forgot something about me. I was my father's son. I didn't give up when something was broken. I took it apart, piece by piece, until I found out why. I took photos of every page, folded the documents carefully back into the box, and slipped the letter into my pocket. I'd deal with the rest later. But I needed to get it out of there before she realized anything was missing. As I climbed the stairs, the faint sound of rain started tapping against the windows upstairs. I paused halfway up, glancing back at the shadows stretching across the basement floor. That place had held its secrets long enough. When I opened the door to the kitchen, Vera was waiting with a cup of tea in her hand. "Leaving already?" she asked sweetly. "Yeah," I said. "Got what I needed." She tilted her head. "Find anything interesting down there? Just dust and old memories." Her smile didn't move, but her eyes stayed locked on mine longer than they should have. I knew she suspected something. "Take care, Ethan," she said finally, her voice like silk wrapping around a knife. "You've always had a hard time letting things go." I nodded once and walked out into the rain, clutching the letter in my pocket like it was the only thing keeping me standing. I didn't know what to do next. All I knew was that the basement had given me back something I'd lost a long time ago. The truth. And the truth has a way of changing everything. By the time I reached my truck, the rain had turned into a downpour, drumming hard against the windshield, like it was trying to keep me from leaving. I sat there for a while, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the house. Behind one of those glowing windows was Vera, probably sipping her tea and thinking she'd won. But she didn't know what I had in my pocket. She didn't know the game had just changed. I drove to a motel off I-5. The kind where the carpet smelled like cigarettes and loneliness. I laid the metal box on the bed, opened it again, and spread the papers out under the yellow lamp. My father's signature, clear and firm, stared back at me. It wasn't just a will. It was proof that she'd built her empire on a lie. I couldn't take this to the cops yet. 10 years had passed. I needed someone who knew how to handle this. Someone who could tell me if what I had was enough to burn her whole illusion down. That was when I thought of Harrison Reed, my father's old lawyer, the one Vera had pushed out. It took me half the night to find him. His name popped up in an old business directory tied to a small law practice in Salem. The next morning, I was standing outside a one-story brick building with his name etched on the window. When I stepped inside, a woman at the front desk looked up from her computer. She was maybe in her 50s. Sharp eyes behind glasses. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said. "But if Harrison Reed still works here, tell him Ethan Calloway needs to see him." Her expression softened the moment I said my name. She didn't ask questions. She just disappeared down the hall. A minute later, a familiar voice came from the doorway. "Ethan Calloway. Well, I'll be damned." He looked older but steady, with the same trimmed beard and cautious eyes I remembered from when I was a kid sitting in my father's office. He shook my hand firmly. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again. Come in." His office smelled like old books and rain. I closed the door behind me, reached into my jacket, and placed the will on his desk. For a second, he didn't say a word. He picked it up, his hands trembling slightly as he turned each page. When he reached the last one, he set it down carefully and leaned back in his chair. "This," he said quietly, "is the real one. I notarized this document myself. Richard signed it in front of me 6 days before his accident." I felt my throat tighten. "Then what the hell happened? How did she replace it?" Harrison rubbed his temples. "After the accident, Vera called me, said you were in no condition to handle legal matters and that Richard had updated the will privately through another attorney. I should have known something was wrong. She made me sign a release to transfer the estate to a new firm. That lawyer, Collins, took over everything. She paid him." I said flatly. He nodded. "Probably. But that's hard to prove after all this time. The only way this stands in court is if we can show intent to conceal fraud. 10 years is a long time. Ethan, I don't care how long it's been. She stole my father's legacy." He studied me for a long moment. "You'll need evidence. Not just a will. Paper trails. Witnesses. Anything connecting her to those fake documents. Do you know anyone still at Callaway Energy who might talk? Maybe one? Alex Chen. He was the CFO back when my father was alive. Stayed on under Vera." Harrison leaned forward. "If you can get Alex to confirm anything financial discrepancies, altered filings, we might have something real. But be careful. If she's been hiding this for 10 years, she won't hesitate to protect it now." I nodded. "Where do I start?" He smiled faintly. "A trace of the old mentor I used to know. Start by finding out how deep she buried you." We spent the next 2 hours going over what I had. Harrison scanned the document, took photos, and checked the notary seal. Everything matched. Before I left, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Your father trusted you more than anyone, Ethan. That's why he left this for you to find." The basement was his way of saying he still believed in you. I didn't know what to say. The words hit harder than I expected. For years, I'd convinced myself my father had stopped believing in me long before he died. Now I realized he'd never stopped at all. Outside, the rain had eased into a steady drizzle. I called Alex Chen that afternoon. He didn't answer the first 2 times. On the third call, he finally picked up. "Ethan, I never thought I'd hear your voice again," he said, cautious but not unkind. "I need to talk. It's about my father's estate. About Vera." There was a pause. "You shouldn't be calling me on this line. Meet me at Riverfront Cafe in an hour. And Ethan, don't bring anyone." The cafe was quiet when I arrived. Alex sat in the corner, dressed in a dark suit that looked more expensive than his old salary could explain. He looked tired, older. The way people look when they've been carrying secrets for too long. You look just like him, he said as I sat down. Richard. He had that same look in his eyes when he was onto something. I pulled the copy of the will from my jacket and slid it across the table. Tell me what you know. He opened it, his expression tightening. God help me. I remember this version. I saw it once in Richard's office before the crash. Vera told everyone later it had been replaced. He lowered his voice. After she took over, she had a team review all legal archives. A month later, files were missing. Financial statements, contracts, even notary correspondence. She told me to sign off on new records to streamline the system. I didn't think much of it at the time. She paid someone. I said. Harrison thinks it was Collins. Alex nodded slowly. It wasn't just Collins. There was another name. A man in the records office at Multnomah County. She transferred $200,000 to a private account that year labeled legal expenses. I have the old email chains. They're on my laptop at home. I leaned forward. I need them. His eyes darted to the window. Ethan. If she finds out I'm helping you, I could lose everything. She already took everything from me. Don't let her do it to you too. He hesitated. Then exhaled. All right. I'll get them to you. Give me 2 days. I reached out my hand. He shook it firmly. You're doing the right thing. Alex. He looked away. You say that now. Let's see what you think when she comes after you. As I walked back to my truck, the city lights shimmered on the wet pavement. For the first time in years, I felt something like purpose again. The kind that burns low and steady. Not the desperate kind that fades with failure. I had the truth. A real ally. And a reason to fight. But as I drove away from the cafe, I caught sight of a black sedan in the rearview mirror. It followed me for 6 blocks before turning off. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe Vera already knew I was digging. Either way, I wasn't stopping. Not this time. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Vera's face. Calm and certain. Like she already knew what I was doing. The next morning, I checked my phone first thing. No messages from Alex. I told myself it was fine. He said 2 days. But something in my gut wouldn't sit still. I drove to work but couldn't focus. I kept replaying our conversation at the cafe. Every word. Every nervous glance he'd given to the window. He knew too much. If she suspected him, he'd be the first to pay for it. That night I called him again. Straight to voicemail. I left a short message. Nothing specific. Just that I hoped he was all right. The next day, I got a text. Unknown number. Meet me where we first talked. 6 p.m. Come alone. I was there early. The same cafe. Same corner booth. Only Alex wasn't there. I ordered a black coffee. Waited half an hour. Nothing. I was about to leave when a delivery guy walked in holding a small package with my name on it. Guy said to give this to you. He said, handing it over. Inside was a thumb drive and a folded note. 3 words. She knows everything. I didn't stay. I paid and left through the side door. Walking fast toward my truck, halfway down the block, I heard the sound. Tires screeching. A sharp thud. And the crunch of metal on metal. I turned just in time to see a car slam into another at the intersection. People started running toward it. Shouting. I froze when I saw who was behind the wheel of the smaller car. Alex. I pushed through the crowd. Yelling his name. The driver's door was crushed inward. His eyes found mine for a second before they rolled back. Someone pulled me away as paramedics arrived. I waited outside the hospital for hours until a nurse came out to say he'd made it through surgery. A concussion. 2 broken ribs. But he'd live. The cops said it looked like an accident. A hit and run. But I didn't buy it. Not for a second. The next morning, a nurse called to say Alex wanted to see me. When I got to his room, he looked pale but alert. His voice was rough when he spoke. I sent the drive before they got to me. Who? I asked. He shook his head. Doesn't matter. You need to use what's on it before she buries it too. I gripped the side of his bed. You think she ordered this? He looked at me like I was a fool for asking. You still don't understand what she's capable of. She's built her life on covering up your father's death and your inheritance. She doesn't lose. I'm not backing down. He smiled faintly. Then you'd better win fast. That night I plugged the drive into my laptop at the motel. Inside were folders, all labeled with dates from 2015 and 2016. Payment receipts, private emails, bank statements. I opened one of the emails. It was between Vera and someone named W. Collins. She'd transferred $200,000 to him for legal modifications. Another showed wire transfers to an account under a fake consulting firm. Then there was one more file. Audio recording. I clicked play. Vera's voice came through clearly. Cool and deliberate. Once the sale finalizes, we'll move the trust into Caleb's name. Ethan won't contest. He doesn't have the resources. Then another voice. Caleb's. And if he does, Vera laughed softly. Then we make sure no one listens to him. My hands tightened on the keyboard. I copied everything to 2 separate drives. One for me. One for Harrison. Then I sent him a message to meet me the next morning at his office. When I got there, he was already waiting with coffee and a legal pad full of notes. I handed him the drive. He plugged it in and listened to the audio. His face darkened with each passing second. This is enough to reopen the estate case, he said. The will. The payments. The recording. It proves intent. She knew exactly what she was doing. What happens now? We file a fraud petition. But you should be prepared. She'll fight this with everything she has. She'll smear you. Drag your name through the dirt. Are you ready for that? I looked him dead in the eye. I lost everything once already. I'm not afraid to lose again. He nodded. A small, proud smile forming. That's your father's son talking. We agreed to keep the filing quiet for now. Just until the paperwork was ready. Harrison said he'd reach out to a financial investigator he trusted to verify the transactions. As I left his office, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. This time it was a message. Stop digging. I didn't respond, but I checked my mirrors the whole drive home. That night, someone knocked on my motel door around midnight. 3 sharp knocks. I reached for the wrench I kept by the nightstand before opening it. No one was there. Only a white envelope taped to the door. Inside was a photo. It was me. Taken that morning outside Harrison's office. On the back, written in neat handwriting, were 2 words. Last warning. I stared at it for a long time. My pulse was loud in my ears. Then I folded the photo, slipped it into my pocket, and sat down on the edge of the bed. I thought of my father again, of what he'd written. If anything happens, trust the basement. He must have known this day would come. The next morning, I got a call from Harrison. His voice was tight. Ethan. Something's happened. Alex is gone. What do you mean gone? They said he checked out of the hospital last night. Never made it home. His apartment's been cleaned out. The line went silent for a few seconds before Harrison spoke again. You're running out of time. If we don't move now, everything disappears. I looked at the window. The morning light was gray, thin, cold. Vera was tightening the noose. But she'd underestimated one thing. I wasn't that scared son anymore who walked away 10 years ago. I had her voice, her lies, her signature. And this time, she was going to see what happened when the truth finally surfaced. The first time Vera called me after all those years, her voice was as smooth as ever. Like nothing had changed. I was packing up my things from the motel when the phone buzzed. Her number flashing across the screen. For a second, I almost didn't answer. But curiosity won. Ethan, she said. Her tone calm and polite. Like she was checking in on an old friend. We need to talk. I took a slow breath. About what your fake will, or the people who keep following me. She let out a soft laugh. You always did have a flair for dramatics. Can we speak in person? I think we've both had enough of lawyers. I'm not meeting you anywhere private. Then come to the house. I promise. No games. I hung up without responding. But an hour later, I was driving toward Portland again. The house looked exactly the same as the day I'd left it. Clean, sharp, and hollow. Vera opened the door before I even knocked. She wore a white blouse. Simple gold jewelry. The same scent of roses she always used. Behind her, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and control. I was hoping you'd be smart enough to stay away from this, she said, motioning for me to come inside. I was hoping you'd be smart enough not to commit fraud. I said, walking past her. She didn't flinch. Fraud is such an ugly word. I took care of what was rightfully mine. Richard wanted you to grow up, to stop depending on him. I only made sure his wishes were honored. I turned to face her. Your version of honoring his wishes involved forging his signature and stealing 10 years of my life. Her eyes hardened. You have no idea what you're talking about. Those documents you found won't hold up. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to concealed fraud. I cut in. I talked to Harrison. You kept everything hidden deliberately. That clock never started ticking. For the first time, her expression cracked. It wasn't fear. Not yet. But surprise. She took a step closer. Her voice quieter now. You think this makes you some kind of hero. You're playing with things you don't understand. Ethan, there are people involved who won't hesitate to make this disappear. And I don't just mean the papers. I stared at her, reading between the lines. You mean Alex? She smiled faintly. He was careless. Some people just aren't built for pressure. My stomach turned. What did you do to him, me? Nothing. Accidents happen. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to react. She watched me, waiting for me to break, to yell, to lose control like she always expected. But I didn't. I just looked at her and said, You're done. Vera, it's over. She tilted her head slightly, that same gentle tone slipping back in. Oh. Ethan, you've always mistaken defiance for strength. That's why your father never trusted you with the company. He said you were impulsive, emotional. He told me so himself. That's a lie. I said, my voice low. She smiled. You can believe whatever makes you sleep at night. I turned to leave. But her words followed me like a cold wind. You should think carefully before pushing this further. The truth can ruin more than reputations. It can destroy families. I didn't answer. I walked out, got in my truck, and drove until I was halfway across the city before I realized my hands were shaking. That night, I met with Harrison again, and we went through the recordings together. He had already sent copies to his contact at the state attorney's office. It's enough to file, he said. But before we do, I need to warn you, once we make this public, there's no going back. She'll come after you in court and outside it. Are you ready for that kind of war? I nodded. I was ready the moment she burned those papers in front of me. Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying me for a long time. Then we'll start tomorrow morning. I'll handle the filing. You should keep your head down. But keeping my head down wasn't an option anymore. That evening, I drove past the Callaway Energy headquarters. It was all glass and steel. My father's dream turned into her empire. A large banner hung across the building's entrance, advertising a press event next week. Callaway Energy partners with Kramer Industries. Harrison's words came back to me. If she finalized a major sale before the fraud came out, she could bury everything under corporate restructuring. Once that money moved offshore, no one would touch her. I parked a few blocks away and called Maggie Torres, the investigative journalist Harrison had once mentioned. She answered after 2 rings. You're Ethan Callaway, yes. Harrison said you could help. I can if you've got something worth my time. I have proof that the CEO of Callaway Energy forged my father's will, stole control of the company, and laundered millions. There was a pause. That's worth my time. Meet me tomorrow at 9 a.m. downtown. Café Luna. When I arrived the next morning, Maggie was already there. A black coffee in one hand and a recorder in the other. She looked sharp, focused. The kind of person who didn't waste words. Show me what you've got, she said. I handed her a flash drive. Emails. Payment records. A recording of Vera admitting to fraud. She scanned a few files on her laptop, her eyebrows rising slightly. This is solid. If this is authenticated, it's not just corporate fraud. It's criminal. I'm not looking for headlines. I said, I just want justice. You'll get both, she said, closing the laptop. But you need to understand what happens when this goes public. Vera Callaway will be headline news. So will you. The story of the betrayed son always sells. I didn't care about the attention. I cared about the truth. Maggie promised to contact her legal team and start verifying the files. That night, I got a call from Harrison again. His voice was tight. She knows about the filing. Ethan. Someone at the clerk's office tipped her off. She's trying to rush the partnership deal before the injunction lands. How long do we have? 3 days at best. Maybe less. I sat there in the dark motel room, the city buzzing faintly outside the window. My father's letter felt heavy in my pocket. 3 days. That's all I had to stop her from selling off the company, from erasing what was left of his legacy. I grabbed my jacket, started the engine, and headed back toward the city. I didn't have a full plan yet, but I knew where to start. If she thought she could bury the truth again, she'd forgotten what she taught me 10 years ago. You can hide a lie under money, under signatures, under power, but you can't hide it forever. Not when someone is willing to dig deep enough. 3 days. That was all the time I had to stop her from selling off everything my father built. I spent the first night driving aimlessly through Portland, thinking, planning, trying not to let the weight of it crush me. By morning, I had a plan, or at least the beginnings of one. Maggie met me at her office downtown. A small space cluttered with case files and empty coffee cups. She looked like she hadn't slept either. The article's ready, she said. If the sale goes through before we publish, she'll use it to frame herself as the victim. But if we hit her before the contract is signed, we'll control the narrative. Harrison joined us not long after. Suit wrinkled, tie loosened, holding a folder thick with legal documents. The injunction's been filed, he said. But we won't get a hearing until Monday. That gives her 72 hours to push the sale through. So we stall her, I said. Maggie frowned. How? By making her scared. She needs confidence to close that deal. If she starts worrying that her partners think she's dirty, she'll hesitate. Maggie nodded slowly. You want me to leak part of it? Just enough to make her panic. That afternoon, she sent out an anonymous tip to 3 major financial outlets, hinting at irregularities in Callaway Energy's ownership structure. By the next morning, the rumor was everywhere. The company's stock dropped 6% before lunch. Vera must have been furious, because she called me that evening. Her voice was sharp this time, stripped of its sweetness. You think you can play games with me? Ethan, you have no idea who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, I said. And so, will everyone else soon. You won't win this. You never had the stomach for it. That's why your father chose me to run the company. You forged your way into that office. Vera, I'm just taking back what you stole. There was a pause. Then she said, You don't deserve his name. And hung up. The next morning, I woke up to a news alert. Callaway Energy denies allegations of fraud. Ahead of $120 million sale. There she was on TV, smiling into microphones, acting like the perfect CEO, calm and composed. Caleb stood beside her in his tailored suit, looking every bit the loyal son she wanted him to be. I could almost admire her composure. Almost. That night, Maggie called. You're not going to like this. I found something in the contract drafts. They're planning to transfer the majority of company assets to an offshore holding company before the sale. Once that happens, even if you win in court, the money's gone. I leaned against the window, trying to steady my breathing. How long before they sign tomorrow morning? 10 o'clock. I grabbed my jacket and drove to Harrison's office. He was still awake, poring over files. We can't let that contract close, I said. There has to be something we can do. He rubbed his forehead. If we can prove active fraud before the sale, I can request an emergency freeze order. But we need undeniable proof connecting her to the transfers. Something signed, recorded, or witnessed. I thought of the recording. The one where she said we'll move the trust into Caleb's name. Would that work? He nodded slowly. It might. But we'll need an official transcript authenticated by a third party. Maggie's contact at the local news station knew someone who could help. By midnight, we had a notarized transcript ready to go. Harrison typed the request, hands shaking slightly from exhaustion. Once I file this, there's no hiding. She'll know exactly who did it. Let her, I said. We filed the motion at 2 a.m. By 9:30, I was parked outside Callaway Energy headquarters. Employees in suits hurried through the rain, clutching coffee cups and umbrellas. Cameras were already gathering near the entrance. The air felt electric, heavy with anticipation. At 10 sharp, Vera arrived, Caleb by her side. She stepped out of her car like she owned the city. The press swarmed her, shouting questions. Mrs. Calloway. Is it true? The Department of Justice has opened an inquiry. She didn't flinch. Completely false. Our company is built on integrity. These baseless rumors are the work of a disgruntled former employee. That was my cue. I stepped out of my truck and walked straight through the crowd. The moment she saw me, her expression froze. For a heartbeat. We just stared at each other. Good morning, Vera, I said. Get out of here. Ethan, this isn't your place anymore. Neither is it yours. I held up a small folder. Court order. The sales frozen pending investigation. Her hand tightened on her briefcase. You can't be serious. Take it up with the judge. Or the press. Reporters swarmed us. Cameras flashing. Caleb stepped forward, his jaw tight. You think you've won something here? I think I've stopped you from stealing what's left of my father's company. He leaned in close. You have no idea what you've started. I looked him dead in the eye. Maybe not. But it's finally your turn to lose sleep. Harrison appeared a few minutes later with a pair of federal investigators. They served Vera with papers on the spot. The crowd went silent as she was escorted into a black car. Cameras clicking furiously. As I watched her drive away, the adrenaline drained out of me, leaving only exhaustion. Maggie came up beside me, notebook in hand, eyes wide. That was one hell of a move. Ethan, you just froze $120 million with one signature. It's not over yet, I said quietly. She's not the kind of person who goes quietly. Maggie nodded. Then let's make sure she doesn't get the last word. That night, the headlines were everywhere. Callaway Energy CEO under investigation for inheritance fraud. Stock trading halted. Investors panicked. And for the first time in 10 years, the story wasn't about Vera's success. It was about her lies. But I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because I knew Vera too well. She'd spent a decade controlling every move. Every word. Every dollar. She wasn't going to stop now. And as I sat in the quiet motel room, watching the rain streak down the glass, I realized something that made my stomach turn. For the first time since this all began, I wasn't the only one fighting for my father's legacy. Now Vera was fighting for her survival. And people like her don't fight clean. The first hearing took place 2 weeks later. The courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the steps. Cameras flashing as Vera stepped out of her car in a dark blue suit. Her lawyer trailing behind her. She looked composed. Polished. Untouchable. In the same way she always had when she was lying. Caleb followed. Jaw tight. Sunglasses on despite the cloudy sky. I watched from the other side of the steps. Harrison stood next to me, flipping through his briefcase. Calm as ever. You ready for this? He asked. Been ready for 10 years. I said. Inside, the air felt thick. The kind of silence that hums before a storm. The judge, Marshall Hayes, was an older man with a reputation for being fair but relentless. He glanced at both tables before speaking. This court is here to determine the validity of the Callaway estate documents and the allegations of fraud presented against Mrs. Vera Callaway, Vera's attorney. A slick man named Prescott. Wasted no time. Your Honor. This entire case is built on fabrications from a bitter son who was disinherited for good reason. My client has led this company with integrity and honor for a decade. These allegations are nothing more than an attempt to extort her. Harrison stood. Your Honor. The evidence will show that the original will was deliberately concealed, replaced with a forged version signed after Mr. Callaway's death. We have financial records proving money was exchanged to facilitate this fraud, along with an audio recording of Mrs. Callaway admitting to it. Vera didn't flinch. She just crossed her legs and looked straight ahead like none of it mattered. The first day dragged on with procedural arguments. The judge decided to hear witness testimony the next morning. When we left the courtroom, reporters swarmed us, shouting, questions. I said nothing. Vera, on the other hand, smiled for the cameras. The truth always wins, she told them. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying every word she'd said over the years. Every lie she'd fed me until I believed I didn't deserve anything. But tomorrow, for the first time, the truth would speak for itself. The next morning, Harrison called Alex to the stand first. He looked nervous but steady, dressed in a plain gray suit. His hands trembled slightly as he raised them for the oath. When Harrison asked about the missing financial records, Alex explained how Vera had ordered him to reclassify large transfers as legal expenses. He identified the emails, the payments, and confirmed that she had personally signed off on every one. Prescott tried to tear him apart on cross-examination. Mr. Jen, isn't it true you were fired for incompetence? Alex didn't back down. I resigned, because I refused to falsify numbers. And you expect us to believe that after all these years you suddenly decided to tell the truth? Alex looked at Vera. Then, at the judge. I should have spoken up sooner. That's my only regret. When he stepped down, I caught his eye and nodded. For the first time, he looked lighter. Like he'd finally set down a weight he'd been carrying for too long. Then it was my turn. I walked to the stand, palms sweating, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Harrison asked me to recount the events, the funeral, the will reading, finding the box in the basement. I told everything, every detail I could remember, right up to the moment I uncovered the real document. When Prescott stood for cross-examination, he smiled, like a man who thought he'd already won. Mr. Calloway, you have quite a vivid memory. Tell me, do you often break into private property to search for hidden treasure? I met his eyes. It wasn't private property. It was my father's house, which, as you said, belonged to Mrs. Calloway. You were trespassing. I was retrieving something that belonged to me. He smirked. A convenient excuse for theft. I could feel Vera watching me, waiting for me to snap, to lose control like I always had before, but I didn't. I leaned forward slightly. You can call it whatever you want. The truth doesn't need my permission to exist. Prescott opened his mouth, then shut it. The judge called for a recess. Outside the courtroom, Vera walked past me without a word, but as she passed, she whispered just loud enough for me to hear. You think you've beaten me? You've only just started the fire. I watched her walk away, surrounded by her lawyers and security. For the first time, she didn't look untouchable. She looked cornered. That night, Maggie called. You might want to turn on the news, she said. Every channel was covering the case. Headlines read, Calloway Energy under investigation for decade of fraud. The audio recording had leaked. Vera's voice played over and over. We'll move the trust into Caleb's name. Ethan won't contest. He doesn't have the resources. The clip went viral in hours. Investors started pulling out. Kramer Industries announced they were suspending all negotiations until the investigation concluded. The next morning, the courthouse was surrounded by twice as many reporters. Vera arrived without Caleb. She kept her head down, her face pale beneath her makeup. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. After reviewing the evidence, he said, This court finds that the will submitted by Mrs. Calloway was fraudulent and therefore invalid. The original will, verified by the notary and witness signatures, is reinstated. All controlling interest in Calloway Energy Solutions is hereby transferred to Mr. Ethan Calloway. The sound that filled the room wasn't applause. It was the flash of cameras, the rush of whispers. Vera sat perfectly still, eyes forward, as if she'd known this moment was coming all along. Then the judge continued. Furthermore, this court recommends the matter of forged documentation and financial misrepresentation be referred to the state attorney for criminal investigation. Prescott tried to object, but the judge had already left the bench. Reporters swarmed me the moment I stepped outside. Harrison stood beside me, shielding me from questions. Somewhere behind us, I heard the click of handcuffs. I turned just in time to see two officers escorting Vera away. She didn't look at me. Not once. Harrison placed a hand on my shoulder. It's over, he said quietly. I shook my head. Not yet. Because deep down, I knew there were still pieces missing. Caleb hadn't been charged. The offshore accounts were still out there. And Vera, even in handcuffs, still looked like someone who had one last move left to play. That night, I drove past the Callaway Energy building. The company logo was still lit, shining against the dark sky. My father's name was finally back where it belonged. But for some reason, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the calm before something I couldn't yet see coming. 2 months later, the Callaway building felt different. The walls that used to echo with silence now buzzed with quiet energy again. My name was back on the office door, but it still felt strange seeing it there. The company had been rebuilt from ashes, and I was the one holding the match that started it all. The court's decision became national news. Vera was convicted of fraud and forgery, sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. Caleb avoided prison time, but his reputation was destroyed. He tried to reach out once through a lawyer, asking for leniency. I didn't respond. Some debts can't be paid with apologies. Harrison stayed on as my legal advisor, though he acted more like a mentor. Every time I visited his office, he reminded me of one thing: don't let revenge define what you do next. Your father built this place to create, not destroy. I understood what he meant. I had spent years chasing justice. But justice and peace aren't the same thing. Once the adrenaline faded, I was left with quiet. And in that quiet, I had to face what came after. The company's board voted unanimously to reinstate me as CEO. It should have felt like victory, but it felt more like responsibility. Every decision carried my father's shadow. Every meeting reminded me of the years I'd lost. But instead of running from it, I leaned in. I kept the name. I kept the mission. And I started changing the culture. We funded renewable energy research, gave scholarships to young engineers, opened a community program under my father's name. I even turned Vera's old corner office into a small museum filled with my father's early designs. People asked if that was my way of rubbing salt in the wound. It wasn't. It was my way of keeping him alive in the only place he ever truly lived. One morning, as I walked through the office, Maggie was waiting in the lobby. She smiled when she saw me. "You clean up well for a guy who used to live in a motel," she said. I laughed. "You mean a hero of corporate redemption?" She held up a notebook. "I just wanted to say thanks. The article helped more people than you realize. The story of what Vera did made others come forward. 3 more inheritance fraud cases opened because of it. That's good," I said. "People need to know the truth can fight back." She closed the notebook. "You ever think of writing your own story?" I looked around the lobby, at my father's portrait hanging above the reception desk. "No," I said quietly. "I think living it is enough." Later that week, I visited the old house one last time. The property had been returned to me after the trial, but I didn't plan to live there again. Some walls carried too many ghosts. I parked by the curb and walked through the overgrown yard. The front door creaked the same way it used to when I was a kid sneaking in late. Inside, everything was dust and stillness. The smell of old wood and time filled the air. I made my way down to the basement, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The same cold concrete, the same cracked walls. But now it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like the start of everything. The metal box was still there, sitting on the old workbench where I'd left it. I opened it and found the note again, folded neatly. "If anything happens, trust the basement." I ran my hand over the faded ink. "You were right, Dad," I whispered. The truth was always here. As I stood there, sunlight streamed through the small window near the ceiling, breaking through the years of dust. I left the note on the table, turned off the flashlight, and walked back upstairs. Outside, the air smelled like rain. I locked the door behind me and slipped the key into my pocket. Maybe someday I'd sell the place. Maybe I wouldn't. But for now, I wanted it to stay exactly as it was. A reminder that the darkest places can still hold light if you know where to look. That night, I met Harrison for dinner. He was sipping whiskey when I arrived. "To second chances," he said, raising his glass. I lifted mine. "And to people who never stop believing," he smiled. "Your father would be proud." After dinner, I walked alone through the city streets. Portland was quiet, the sidewalks slick from a light drizzle. I passed a newsstand with my name on the cover of a magazine. From Scandal to Salvation: How Ethan Callaway Reclaimed His Father's Legacy. I didn't buy it. I didn't need to. I already knew how the story ended. A few months later, I used part of my inheritance to start a foundation called the Truth Will Foundation. It helps victims of financial abuse and inheritance fraud get legal aid. Maggie became its communications director. Harrison joined the board. Sometimes I still think about Vera, about how she built her world on lies so carefully that she probably believed them by the end. Maybe she still does. The last time I saw her, she was in court, looking at me without hate, without remorse, just emptiness. I don't hate her anymore. Hate is a cage, and I've spent too long locked inside one. Now, every morning, I wake up before sunrise. My apartment overlooks the Willamette River. I drink coffee by the window, watching the water catch the first light of the day. There's peace in that moment. Quiet and simple. Something my father never got enough of. And something I almost lost forever. Sometimes I think about everything that happened and wonder if it was worth it. The lies. The years. The fight. Then I remember his voice. Steady and sure. Truth is worth every scar it leaves behind. It's funny. The same basement that hid the lie ended up saving the truth. I used to hate that place. Now, I see it for what it really was. Not a trap. A test. One I finally passed. If you've made it this far, remember this. You can bury the truth in darkness. Seal it in concrete. Hide it behind greed and fear. But one day, it will find its way out. And when it does, you'll see that it was never gone. It was just waiting for you to open the door. If this story reminded you that truth always finds a way, share it. Someone out there might need to hear that justice is still possible, that it's never too late to take back what's yours. Stay with us for more stories like this. And never stop believing in the light that waits beneath the dust.